An important part of what's happening in Chapter 1 is a discussion of why this class focuses on communication. Now, all kinds of people do training in all kinds of different contexts, right? Nurses do training, firefighters do training, business people do training. Training is happening in all kinds of different fields. So why study it from a communication perspective? So there are two reasons for this. The first is that training itself is a communicative process. I mean, think about it. Just because someone teaches doesn't mean that somebody learns, right? There's got to be a communicative process that goes on there. And many of the things that make you a good communicator will also make you a good trainer, right? So someone who is capable of understanding where somebody's coming from is more able to get them to learn than somebody who's clueless, right? Or think about somebody who can clearly clearly articulate their message is more likely to consistently train a group of people than somebody who can't clearly express their message. So in part, training itself, every act of training is in a way a communicative process. I mean, it is communication. So part of the reason that we study training from a communicative perspective, why the discipline of communication has trainers, why our department offers a class in training, is because what makes you a good communicator is also what makes you a good trainer. But there's another and possibly more compelling reason, and that is much of what we try to train people how to do is communication. Think about it. We often train people how to improve customer satisfaction. Well, how do you get customers to be satisfied? In a way, you find out what they need and make sure that you deliver messages in ways that they interpret it so that they that they got what they wanted. So a customer is satisfied in a way because of successful employee-customer communication. Think about another thing that often happens in training programs, how to avoid sexual harassment in the workplace. Well, sexual harassment, of course, is a communication behavior, right? It's the manifestation of sexuality and power inside of an organization as expressed through messages and behaviors and how they're interpreted by other people. So in part what you do is you teach people how to better interpret their own actions in light of the other so that nobody feels like they're being taken advantage of. So you can go through a lot of what we train people how to do. Leadership skills, management skills, small group skills, speaking skills, and you start noticing a common denominator, which is that much of what we are desiring out of our employees are better communication skills. And this is no mystery. If you look at the top of most qualifications for most jobs, good spoken and written communication skills often makes the top of the charts. And when people talk about the problems that they're having in their workplace, not that often are those problems merely technical. Very often those problems are a combination of the technical aspects of the workplace mixed with a series of people problems. Maybe inability to coordinate across the team, lack of understanding between team members, or general emotional turmoil in the place, much of which can be addressed from a communicative perspective. So when I say this class takes a communication focus, part of what I'm saying is not only are we going to look at the communication behavior that makes you better teachers, but also we're going to look at how we're training people to be better communicators in a broad context. Now, don't get me wrong, this class is going to teach you more than just how to improve someone's leadership skills. We're going to talk about training in general. So we're going to talk a lot about learning styles and methods of getting people to actually internalize things and how to change behaviors. But a lot of that is going to be framed in the broader insights that communication offers about the human condition. So with that in mind, we're going to learn some communication. Now, what communication is, different people will tell you different things, but I want to start with a real straightforward model of communication called the transactional model of communication. And it's just kind of an entry point. It's a way to start to think about communication and to get like a more complex vocabulary about what communication is. Now you may have learned the transactional model before, and I may start drawing it here with the sidewalk chalk, and you'll recognize, oh yeah, I learned this in another class. But many of you may not have learned this, so we'll start there with the transactional model. So we'll start here with our sidewalk chalk, with the sender, right? So a message is often created by somebody who wants to say something. Right, in the case of training, you're often the sender. You've got a training module that you want to get across to someone. So now as a sender, you can't just express, you start with a thought, right? There's something that you want to say. But you can't just merely express an idea in its entirety. You've got to like translate it into a thing that other people understand. I can't just think something and somebody else knows it. So there's this process where I transform a thought into an actual message, right? And that process is called an encoding process. Basically, it starts with, say, a rumbling in your stomach, and you kind of know what that is. It's hunger. But then you articulate it in a language, and you say, man, I'm hungry. Let's go get some food, right? So that's a process there, right? So the sender, you've got a thought, you encode that thought into an actual message. Now, once you've got the message, you send it over to somebody who on the other side, who we're going to call a receiver. Go figure, sender has got a receiver. Now the receiver, much like the sender, doesn't, although you receive the message, it's not immediately meaningful. They go through a similar process, a decoding process, so that they have an actual thought, right? So the sender has the thought, they encode it, they send the message, the receiver receives the message, they decode it, and they have a thought. Now, whenever you send a message, you can't just straight send it. In a way, you have to find a tool, you've got to find a medium, or in the language of the transactional model, you have to find a channel. All of our messages move through channels. Now there are all kinds of things. There's spoken channels, there's written channels, there are all kinds of spoken and written channels. I can text message, I can Facebook, email, I can make phone calls, I can make videos in my parking lot with sidewalk chalk, right? There are all different kinds of channels through which we communicate. And those are the things that our messages move through. Now, it's not quite as simple as one sender and one receiver, right? Because senders and receivers, they take turns. And in truth, while I am a sender, when I come up with a training module, when I am a trainer or as a teacher, I'm not just there to send a message. The entire time, I'm paying attention, I'm thinking about what they're doing. So while I'm sending, I am simultaneously receiving a set of information, and receivers, of course, turn around and become senders in return as they think, encode, and decode messages. So of course this goes back the other way, also moving through channels, and these thoughts that the sender have translate, they encode them into their own messages. And me, the receiver now on the other side, am receiving those messages, which I'm then decoding into more thoughts, right? And this is kind of like the circular, or why it's called the transactional model, the transactional nature of communication. People are thinking, coming up with stuff, creating the messages, sending those messages through channels, people are receiving them, decoding them, having thoughts about them, encoding new messages, sending them through new channels, and that's the process, right? It's circular, goes back and forth. Now there are a couple other things that you got to know. Everywhere there's an arrow, there's a site for error, right? So there's different kinds of noise that can disrupt the message. Sometimes there's physical noise. So in these medium, right, in the channels, let's say that I choose the channel of the cell phone. What's an example of the physical noise, something that disrupts the actual message. Okay, if you thought like static, bad connection, that's an example of physical noise. It disrupts the actual message as it's being sent. But that's not the only way. Sometimes there's interference here, isn't there? Sometimes there's psychological noise that prevents people from properly understanding. So I'm sure some of you have read a book. Let's say you're reading the first page of the text, and even though your eyes are looking at the words, you're not soaking it up because there's what is psychological noise basically distracting you from what's going on inside the actual text. Another thing that happens on the inside of a person is called semantic noise, which is basically noise concerning words. So sometimes I'm going to think my thought and encode them in a style of language that you're not familiar with. So if I only speak Spanish and you don't, I'm going to encode all of my messages in Spanish, send them across, and that's going to constitute semantic noise, which is to say that my message is not going to get transmitted because we use words differently, or in this case, all of my words mean something meaningless to you because you don't speak my language, right? So that's semantic noise. So physical noise disrupts the message here as it's being sent. So that might be loud noises when I'm trying to have a conversation, a failure of internet connection when I'm streaming video, bad connection, with the cell phone. There's also psychological noise, which is distractions, things like this, and semantic noise, which is a confusion over the language. So we're almost there. We're almost done. So we now got the idea of sending, receiving, thoughts encoding messages, decoding back to thoughts. We have this idea of sending messages through channels, but it's also true that all of it takes place inside of a context. So all communication is bounded, right? It's framed in a certain context. And this context is varied. In a way, it's cultural, right? So what we say and do has different meanings depending on the culture. So sometimes, so what does it mean to make direct eye contact with someone? Well, in some cultures, making direct eye contact suggests that you're paying attention and being respectful. In other cultures, making direct eye contact means that you are being you're confronting the person, and if you are of a lower status, you're being disrespectful. So what does eye contact mean? Well, it doesn't have an objective meaning. It's got a meaning that's bounded by this blue line, which is a context, right? So there's a cultural context in which these things are being taken up. There's also a physical context that things are exist in. There's an actual place where things are happening. So what's the right sound level that you should speak at? Well, it depends. If you're in a quiet room, speaking softer is going to be more appropriate because the person's going to be able to hear you. But as you introduce other sounds, other noises, soon speaking softly is going to be inappropriate because of the physical setting, right? And it's going to be interpreted differently. Somebody who is speaking too softly for other people to hear, that's going to upset people, blah, blah, blah. So there's a physical context that it happens in also. There are also social contexts, right, which are sort of small levels of cultural context, but more or less the social context is the particular happenings, the people that are around. A joke is going to hit you differently depending on the social context. So if somebody says, a joke in front of your friends, you feel way more free to laugh at it than if somebody says the same joke in front of your parents. You will probably be hesitant to laugh at certain jokes in front of your parents, not because of what you think is funny or your humor, but because the context influences how we take up messages. I one time went to see a movie, and I was really excited about the movie, and I went to see it with my mother. She hates violent movies, and man, it was way more violent watching it with my mom than when I watched it again later with my friends. In part, the people that are around us change the way that we interpret the things that are happening, right? The social context of a communicative event influences what we know. Now, why is this useful? Why is this important? This can be used strategically. All of these elements really are warnings in a way, right? A lot of times we think, I asked someone something, why the heck are they not getting back to me? I think of
a time that my brother-in-law had insurance, and his car had gotten hit, and he'd called them and they weren't calling him back. He was like, damn it, why won't they call me back? And I said, Tom, why don't you stop calling them and email them? It's called Esurance. Maybe they're better at returning emails than they are phone calls. He had called them for a week, no response. He emailed them and they got back to him within 2 hours. Now, I'll tell you, my thought was, he's tried only one channel. Maybe it's not the message or the way that he's saying it that's the problem. Maybe it's the channel that's the problem. Having not known the transactional model of communication, I still might have thought of it, but it really helps to think as all of these as variables, right? Let's say you have the thought, I want to break up with you. Now, there are a lot of ways to encode that, right? There are a lot of approaches to the I want to break up with you conversation. There are a lot of channels that you can use, right? You can text them, you can email them, you can have the conversation in all kinds of different contexts, right? In front of their parents, in front of their friends, alone. And all of those things are going to change the way it's going to be taken up. It's going to change the meaning. Similarly with training, right? There's a thing that you've got to get them able to do. But there are all of these different variables, different ways of encoding it, different ways of sending it, different channels through which to send it, different context, and all the while attending to that idea of noise, which is that at any of these points there can be a disrupt. And so systematically finding ways to eliminate those disruptions, good, right? So if you've got a training and it's 4 in the afternoon, what do you suppose a form of noise might be after people have had a busy day at work? Maybe hunger, right? They're going to be distracted by the fact that pretty soon they're going to go home and they want to eat and blah, blah, blah. So if you're training people in 4 in the afternoon, attend to that biological noise, which is going to be caused by hunger. If they're thinking about when they're going to get out because they want to eat, they want to go to the snack machine, how much trouble does it really take you as the trainer to buy some apples and some bottled water and to bring them with you? Now, it's going to be more and less necessary depending on the context, of course. Do you bring apples and water to a training session that's happening during lunch? Of course not. And those are fairly obvious examples, but many less obvious things can be illuminated by thinking about these in a strategic way. So there it is, why communication can be valuable in the training context, and an introduction to the transactional model of communication.